First, in the center here, I know all of us know Bradley Myles, Executive Director and CEO of Polaris. For more than a decade, Brad has devoted himself to combating human trafficking and modern slavery on a local, national, and global scale. He helped create and launch the Polaris National Human Trafficking Hotline and is now focusing on strengthening partnerships with technology companies and new data-driven efforts aimed at eliminating modern slavery in the United States and worldwide. To Brad's right, I'm pleased to introduce Malika Saar, Google's Senior Counsel on Civil and Human Rights. Malika is well known as a tenacious, committed human rights lawyer and a longtime advocate in the fight against human trafficking. She was the co-founder and executive director of the Human Rights Project for Girls and also served as special counsel on human rights at the Raven Group. And finally, I'm honored to introduce the moderator, Ambassador Swanee Hunt, former United States Ambassador to Austria, currently the Eleanor Roosevelt Lecturer in Public Policy at Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government, and the founder-director of the Women in Public Policy program at the Kennedy School. But perhaps most relevant for today's discussion is that Ambassador Hunt spearheads Demand Abolition, initiative targeting the buyers seeking to eliminate demand. So, Ambassador Hunt, it's all yours.
Thank you. Can you all hear me? Yes. I consider myself adequately introduced at this point, and so let me say something about Demand Abolition. We've been around, I'm going to guess, 7-8 years, and we're in 12 cities as we're working, which are like petri dishes, to let cities themselves come up with ideas, working with law enforcement, mayors, governors, NGOs, but particularly survivors. And it's really, really interesting how different these cities are. You know, Seattle, Denver, Houston, Boston, et cetera, Atlanta, and LA. Go on our website, okay? Because I actually can name the 12, but you don't want me to. And so some of them are using a tactic like putting up a fake ad and then having some parishioners, actually, so about 100 men from a church who are answering the ad and saying, you know, it's not who you think, but let me talk to you because, hey, bro, yeah, I know you're not trying to do harm, but let me tell you about the life of these women. And it seems kind of insipid to me, but they've now talked to like tens of thousands of these buyers, these would-be buyers, and they're starting to see now how the men with those phone numbers are not calling back. So you can see some real results. And they also are seeing which ones do call back over and over, and those numbers go to the police. And so the police can target their interventions. So, you know, what seemed to me like, you know, this is just like too easy a tactic has turned out to be replicable and we think very effective. Now I say we think because now we have to get some serious research dollars to know which tactics are effective. I'm just giving you one example, and really truly do go on the website for Demand Abolition. It's, I think, really, really interesting. That's how I came to know. Is that how I came to know you, Brad? Yeah. But we've known each other a long time. How long do you think?
10.
10 years? Whoa. Well, when did you start Polaris? You're not sure.
No, I joined Polaris in 2004.
2004. Yeah. So anyway, very long time. And you were younger and I was younger. Like you were like really younger.
Very true.
I was just a little younger.
Very true.
It's all relative, right? It's percentage. Okay. And anyway, I think the world of Brad. Like he's a superstar. If there's anyone, if you want to get to know in Washington, if you want to get to know someone who is creative, who's big thinking, who is strategic, who is an excellent manager, et cetera, meet Brad and get to know him, corner him out in the lobby. Malika, at Google. I'm looking forward to your input here because you really are an expert in what we're talking about. But thank you for what you're doing for human rights and civil rights there. And it's never been needed more than it is right now. And I know you're at the forefront of sanity. So you are, aren't you? Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yes, right.
It's hard to be in this moment right now. But
Right,
yes, I am.
right. But it takes us all staying focused and committed. All right, so you have a sense of us. We're going to have a conversation, and it's mostly going to be between the two of you, Brad and Malika, but it's also with you all in the audience. We're not doing here's a presentation and here's Q&A. I just can't bear it. Not at 66, I can't do that. But we will have a conversation, and I, as moderator, get to say, hey, why don't we have a question from one of you? So please feel free when we do that. We'll just constantly be making it a four-way conversation here, okay? Good. So who would like to speak about this? You want to talk about the new Attorneys General guidance?
Sure. So I came onto Google last January, and before that I had been at the Human Rights Project for Girls, and I led up a campaign called the No Such Thing campaign, that there is no such thing as a child prostitute, only victims and survivors of child rape. And for me, as a human rights lawyer, that campaign was rooted in my belief that we see ways in which children are being subject to sexual violence through being bought and sold. And yet we don't acknowledge it as sexual violence, right? We call the girl a prostitute, and we allow the individual who in any other context would be construed as committing statutory rape, child sexual abuse, because the rape has been paid for, is named as a John or a buyer. And so my feeling coming from human rights work is that when we allow this kind of normalization of child rape, when we allow a culture of impunity for the act of rape against a child, then we allow the violence to continue. Right? So when we talk about human rights internationally, and we look at parts of the world where gang rape or child marriage is rampant, part of that reason is because there's impunity for those crimes.
Right.
And a human rights legal response is you must end the impunity, and you must name the normalization of the violence. That's why I started the No Such Thing campaign, and that's why I felt the opportunity of being at Google was to take essentially that campaign to the next step. It's important that we name these issues correctly, and part of that, though, is also ensuring that when a child is raped, when a child is purchased for rape, her buyer first is arrested, and second, is not arrested for misdemeanor solicitation. Because this has nothing to do with vice or prostitution or solicitation. This is a form, one of the worst forms of child sexual abuse. And so we have to create a shift in the culture and the legal norms that recognize that this is not about vice, this is about child abuse. And a critical part of doing that, right, is looking at our attorneys general. Our attorneys general, I think, played a very critical role in holding Craigslist accountable, in holding Backpage accountable. I think you see now with the executive order and the work to nullify the executive order, it has been an attorney general, right? So they play a very critical role in being legal champions. And so my hope is that in this space, they can be our champion in helping to change the legal norms of how we go after buyers. And in changing those legal norms, also signal to DAs, to law enforcement, that this approach of naming the violence and holding the buyers accountable is critical. We did this in the domestic violence movement, right?
Yes.
We said that violence against a woman was not a personal matter, was not a private dispute. We named it as violence, and then we held accountable prosecutors, law enforcement, to do the same. And it's the similar approach. We have to name the violence, and now we also have to ensure that the legal community does the same, and that we legally hold responsible those who are buying our children, who are not simply Johns, who are not innocent buyers, who are individuals, again, who in any other context would be treated as those committing statutory rape.
Malika, in around 1980, 81, I was in Colorado, and the very first grant of our foundation, which is called Hunt Alternatives, the very first grant was for a safe house.
Right.
All right? Now, there were a whole bunch of us working on safe houses for women who'd been beaten up and, and with their kids, et cetera. They had fled. And at some point, someone much smarter than I am said, why are they leaving their homes? If he did the beating up, why are they having to be in a safe house? Why isn't he losing his home, right? And it was this aha moment for me, like how, because even our expectations of men and women in the society fed into that, right? And so we got some laws changed, and where a woman who was being beaten up, and let's say the neighbors called the police or whatever, and he says to her, "You open your mouth, you squeal, and I'm coming back for the kids," and so she is supposed to sign some kind of complaint, right, with him standing right there. Right. And so we got the law changed so that the cop could come, take a look at the situation, and say, well, it's pretty clear what's going on here. You've got a busted lip. Mm-hmm. He's all hot and sweaty. Come on, guy, you're going with me, mm-hmm. right? Mm-hmm. And relieved her of that mm-hmm. position. So that's an example of getting that law changed. And by the way, that completely changed the dynamic. Right. So thank you for raising the domestic violence piece. Absolutely. Is there someone out here who would like to comment on what Malika has just said? I'm sure there is. Yes. And would you identify yourself, please?
June Zeitlin with the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, and I just want to endorse 1,000% what Malika is saying. And in addition to domestic violence being an analogy, I think we could also talk about marital rape.
Yep. Right.
Because
exactly right.
For so long, it wasn't considered rape, and then laws were passed, but getting prosecutors to enforce it, and where do you get the evidence? It's he said, she said. So I think all of these issues are very complicated, but I do think by advocating and changing laws even before they're enforced, we're changing norms. And the norms are as important as the laws. So I think continuing this effort and bringing a human rights focus to these issues is really critical.
Thank you so much. Brad, will you, I know, yes, please.
Carol.
No,
No,
please.
Carol first, please.
It's apropos? Yes.
Well, I'm Carol Smolinski from ECPAT USA, and I just wanted to comment on something that often goes unspoken when we're talking about child trafficking when we're in a room with advocates like this, and that is that there's a great deal of anguish and concern and leaping to protection when a prepubescent child is exploited or abused or raped. But as soon as a child reaches the age of puberty, as soon as a child starts to develop, whether he's a boy or she's a girl, and is now being integrated into the adult sex market, society treats that child completely different. Now it's just a victimless crime. They're integrated into the adult sex market. They're sold on Backpage, and everybody gets kind of all squirrely about whether, she wanted it, she liked it. Is this person entitled to protection, or is she or he a prostitute? Somebody who should be arrested. So I say that because in my years of experience on this, I feel like that's not spoken, and it needs to be spoken. So I'm speaking it.
Can I respond quickly to that? Because I think it's a very important point, and I hold it from from a dual lens, right? That girl is a child legally under the age of 18. She is a child, right? And I also talk about this from a racial justice perspective, right? Because let's be clear, most of these girls are black and brown girls.
Thank you.
And we don't allow our black and brown girls to have the status of child very long. So I say this as the mother of a black girl, that it is important to be able to recognize that when our girls, and especially our girls of color, who are sexualized so quickly and at such a younger age, and so systematically deny the status of child with all of the legal protections that a child under the age of 18 has, it is absolutely critical that we be able to say that 16-year-old girl, that 17-year-old girl, she is a girl. And how ironic is it, right? How ironic is it that internationally, when we talk about child marriage, right, we are, and internationally in general, we are very insistent on keeping the long range, right, of status of child and not denying it the minute the girl turns 14 or 15. And I've been taken aback as a human rights lawyer around that dual standard, right, between what we argue for internationally for the rights and legal protections of the child and how we pull away from that with our own girls. And from a racial justice perspective, it is especially worrying to me that we are pulling away from that protection of child for girls who are disproportionately black and brown.
And Malika, before I turn to Brad, when you consider the age at which the average female in the U.S. is starting to end the life, okay? I'm going to use that for slang. And it's what, anywhere from 12 to 14, 15. That girl on her 18th birthday doesn't blow out 18 candles on a cake, and suddenly the buyer is, in this different category, maybe legally in a different category, but let's be real here. That she's been on heroin for 3 years at that point, or 6 years at that point, just to make it through. Mm-hmm. And do we still care about her after her 18th birthday? We must. Different laws will apply, et cetera, but somehow it's the same buyer. He's not saying, I'm dialing your number and can you prove to me you're over 18? That's not his first question. Brad, pick it up.
I guess where I would just chime in, I think to give you some nuts and bolts of what this project is that Malika and the AG guidance has commissioned, which we're very supportive of and very excited to see. I think it's a very strategic piece of work. And I think the reason is right now, no one really has a grasp of how communities across the country are approaching this issue. First, from the very basic question of, are you arresting buyers of children or are you not? So we need to figure out which communities are in the yes category and which communities are in the no category. And I think what we're going to find is that the vast majority of communities are in the no category, and there's going to be maybe a handful of 10, 15, 20 communities that are actually thoughtfully trying to arrest the buyers in a much more systemic way, especially the buyers of children. Then we dig into the no's and ask them, why not? Why aren't you arresting children? Is it because you don't have the evidence? Is it because you don't have the statutes? Is it because you're still stuck in an old norm? Why are you a no? And then when you get into the category of yeses, you ask them, well, how are you doing it? And what we're going to find out is states are each dealing with a patchwork of different types of laws. And so, like, if there was a pie chart of the yeses, some percentage of them are going to say, we're using child sexual abuse statutes, and we're calling this child rape, and we're doing everything that Malika just advocated, and we're disregarding the fact that money was exchanged. This is child rape, and so we're charging the person with child sexual abuse. Some set of communities will be doing that. Another set of communities will be saying, well, we see this as patronizing prostitution, and so we're using our patronizing statutes. But we figured out that certain patronizing statutes have some aggravated factors if the person's a child or if it's particularly egregious. So we're using our patronizing statutes. Other communities are going to say, we're actually using our trafficking statutes and we're charging the buyers with the crime of trafficking. And then Washington State's going to say, we have this really unique statute called the commercial sexual abuse of a child, which Shared Hope did a great job advocating for and lots of other groups advocated for, to basically say, let's create a new law that's specifically about commercially sexually abusing a child and name it, which is one of the only states in the country that has that law. So let's figure out the no's, let's figure out the yeses, let's give some guidance to the no's and try to get them into the category of the yeses, and then let's figure out how the yeses are doing it. What are the pros and cons of using child rape statutes versus patronizing statutes versus trafficking statutes versus this really special statute, commercial sexual abuse of a minor? So I think Malika had a vision for this project and shared it with a number of us and said, are you on board with this? This is what I think the country needs. A bunch of us jumped on board and said, absolutely, that's what the country needs. And now this research has been commissioned, the goal of which is to put some guidance out so that communities can start digging into this as a step towards creating the norm change that Malika is advocating for. But it's going to get very nuanced in these different communities where certain states are going to say, we don't have the commercial sexual abuse of a child statute. And our child sexual abuse statute is written in a certain way that blocks us, and so we have to use the patronizing statute. So we're going to have to mix and match. And if we think right now the country's ready for one single uniform approach across the country, we're nowhere near yet, maybe 10 years from now. But can we start creating a roadmap or a blueprint about how we get all 50 states to have the commercial sexual abuse of a minor statute? Or how do we get standardized training that if you're going to use your patronizing statutes, do it in this way, and here's some best practices. That's what the guidance is all about. I think the AGs need to hear it, and I think it will create a really great ripple effect across the country. How does that fit?
Yes, I want to add to that, but I also, before adding to it, want to acknowledge that Demand Abolition, Polaris, NCMEC, and ECPAT, and I don't think I'm forgetting anyone, have been the critical partners with us in advancing this really important piece of guidance. I just want to add one small piece to it, which is we really are going to encourage moving away from the use of prostitution statutes because we really do want to argue that we have to see this outside of the context of solicitation and prostitution. So anti-trafficking statutes, child sexual abuse statutes, and this amazing statute that Washington State has is really, I think, important in creating and pushing for a change of norms and a roadmap. And it's been fascinating because before we started this, I was like running around saying to all these prosecutors, why aren't you just using child abuse statutes? Like, I don't understand. Like, why can't you use sexual assault of a minor? Why can't you use statutory rape, conspiracy to commit statutory rape? And some of it is that it's not an easy case to build. The other part of it, though, right, is many of the folks that we need don't see the kids as, right, victims and survivors of child rape. And so that is part of what we are required to do, and I think that's the connection to domestic violence as well, is the training and the critical work with judges and prosecutors and law enforcement. So much of that work is already being done, and the folks in this room are part of doing that work. But it really is also about being able to get folks who are so critical to this issue at the front line to be able to understand the kids as survivors of child sexual abuse.
Thank you. Thank you. Join the conversation. Yes.
Hi, Andrea Powell with Fair Girls.
Hold on just a second. Microphone is en route.
I might be able to project.
Here it comes. Here it comes.
Okay. Or not. So I wanted to
say who you are again.
I'm Andrea Powell with Fair Girls. I know many of you as colleagues of mine in the room. I wanted to take a step back and refocus a bit on something that you said around young women and girls of color. 90% of the young women who we serve at Fair Girls here in the District of Columbia, Virginia, Maryland, are in fact girls of color. About 90% are American citizens. And we consistently over the years have worked with both good and bad defense attorneys, prosecutors, but a message that we have been getting over the years is, she's 17, she's practically an adult. And we would turn that around and say, No, legally she's still a child. There's no practically in this. We're talking about serial rape for profit of a child. That's the discussion we're having. But one positive thing I wanted to share with the audience is in the state of Maryland, and starting to see this in District of Columbia as well, we're starting to really track cases as they come in, which means holding child and family service agencies, welfare agencies, direct service agencies like us accountable for reporting every case that you see in kind of 3 broad categories. I won't get into that, but what that means is if you don't make that report and you're someone in kind of that chain who had contact with that child, you're held accountable. And I think that's very important as we start to look at it from that perspective, so that we can start to make sure that every child, regardless of race and color, is identified. And I think that will start to then reshift how we're addressing those who are buyers, because you can't have that many child victims, and there's obviously another side of this conversation. And so I think that I think we're seeing some positive trends, so I wanted to point that out, and I know that both of you have been critical in some of those roadmaps, so I'd love to hear more about that from your perspective.
Great.
I think what we're talking about here on a macro level is a whole series of paradigm shifts. I think Malika, we don't need to restate the importance of norm changing, but I also think it's gonna get into some of the more micro fixes of law enforcement habits and practices, of just standard operating procedures. Like if you encounter a child in the sex trade, you are trained to ask to see their cell phone and look through their past caller ID of the past 30 calls that they have on their cell phone, and you use that as a piece of evidence instead of ignoring that as a piece of evidence. I think there's going to be a lot of law enforcement training about how to interface with child welfare, to Andrea's point. And I think the challenge is right now, in the absence of that training, we're relying upon, instead of standardized systemic practices going out to tens of thousands of police, we're relying on these single champions that are willing to do that in the moment. In the days before I took on the current role at Polaris, when I had a previous role and was working more closely with task forces and going out with the police more regularly, when we would go out with the police through our crisis response team, and they would encounter a child in the sex trade, and we'd be in some hotel out by Dulles Airport, and there'd be FBI agents and police agents, they'd be there. Their central question was, can you tell us about your pimp? It was like, are you gonna flip on your pimp? And can we refer you for services? So I think that in of itself was an evolution, but they still weren't there saying, can we talk about the 30 guys that just committed statutory rape over the past 3 days that you've been in the sex trade? Can we talk about them? And what do you want to say about them? Do you know any of their names? Do you know their addresses? Do you know their information? Just wasn't even part of the conversation. It was all about the child and the pimp. And so I think it's just being systemically ignored on a massive, massive scale. I think if somehow there were an estimate of total number of children in the sex trade in the US that was reliable, and total number of child rapes that have happened, and then look at the numerator and the denominator of that number, I'm sure we're at 0.00001% of the number of times this crime is actually investigated and prosecuted. But what's a cautionary tale for me is to talk to a guy like Val Ritchie, the senior prosecuting attorney in Seattle. This is as cutting edge as you get. He is using the best statute in the country, refuses to charge any child with any form of prostitution, treating all those children as victims, and really going after the buyers and having some of the best results in the country. And then he says, I'm worried that we're only scratching the surface and we could only catch 5 or 10% of the total buyers of children in the Seattle area with actually a law enforcement response. So his message is, let's at least get every community across the country doing some sort of law enforcement response and get a baseline happening. And I think that's what this AG's guidance is going to do. But that's not going to be the full solution. We're going to have to recognize there are 90% of buyers that aren't ever having a law enforcement interaction. And so what are the types of efforts, like Ambassador Hunt brought up, of these guys in Portland, Oregon, who call themselves a bunch of guys, which is, I think, one of my favorite kind of NGO naming practices in the field. Let's just call ourselves a bunch of guys. And they just sit on the phone, place decoy ads for children on Backpage all day, and then get the calls from the buyers, and then these guys talk directly to the buyers, like the ambassador shared. And they've had 12, 15,000 interactions. A lot of those guys won't ever talk to the police. So their only message of you shouldn't be doing this is from that phone call with that guy. So I think there's going to have to be a braiding of law enforcement solutions with non-law enforcement solutions, because the law enforcement solution, as Val Ritchie will tell you, won't get you the whole way there. So can we get a bunch of guys happening all across the country where those types of non-law enforcement community interventions are happening? Why does it need to be guys? Maybe it can be vice cops, female vice cops taking the phone calls and talk to 1,000 guys in a 2-day period like Phoenix did, but no arrests. It's just sending that message. So it's a bit of both.
You know, Nick Kristof, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
Nick Kristof was saying, the columnist in the New York Times, who cares tremendously about this. He said, you don't have to go in and arrest everybody. You've got to arrest X number and then have people like me write columns about it. And there can be a chilling effect when the media comes in. So that's part of what we're talking about here.
I do think it's part of it, but let me be really honest about what gets me nervous. Let's be brutally honest that what we know from our own experiences anecdotally and what we know from the research is that the men who buy the girls are disproportionately white, middle-class, educated folks.
$110,000 a year income.
And we're not comfortable naming them or seeing them as criminals. We're very comfortable seeing the traffickers as criminals because they're disproportionately the black and brown men we send away to prison anyway. So when I hear the community talk about traffickers, I don't hear this conversation of, many of those traffickers are individuals who have been sexually abused themselves. And so how do we talk to them about that part of who they are to stop what they are doing? But I hear all this empathy and this desire to reach out and talk to the buyers.
Yep.
And it makes me uncomfortable because of those underlying demographics and narratives. And it also makes me uncomfortable, and I'm going to say this because I have LCCR here, and I think it's really important that at this moment in the anti-trafficking movement, we get more of a racial justice analysis in our work. There is a long entrenched narrative in this country that black and brown girls, that the black and brown female body is unrapeable, right? And that is present when we talk about this issue, right? These girls can't be victims of rape because they're prostitutes, right? This attachment to a narrative that the black and brown female body is unrapeable. And every time we don't insist on the end of impunity for what's happening to our girls who are disproportionately black and brown, it's a reinforcement of that old, ugly narrative. And so I feel for those reasons, I want to hear us courageously talk about how our girls, our kids, especially our black and brown kids who hold these narratives in this country of not being afforded the status of child, of not being seen as a survivor, a victim of rape, how important it is that we end those narratives of denied status of child and victim, and that we begin to talk about the need to hold accountable those individuals who do this to our kids, regardless of how uncomfortable it might be when those individuals do not conform to our construct of who a criminal is.
Thank you for saying that. You've really touched a nerve for me, because I have been in that place where I hear, well, and such they're intervening and they're recommending that they go to this website. I say, well, what do you mean intervening and recommending? What are you talking about? This is a criminal. I mean, if it was someone who had committed a different crime, if a robbery or something, would you encourage that he go to a website? And I have to tell you, people assume that because I do so much in the feminist community in terms of getting women, trying to get them elected to office, or, it's blah, 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 that I do a whole lot, that I'm into this issue because of the rights of women. And you shouldn't have to have dueling identities, right? But for me, at the base, and you and I haven't talked about, at the base for me, it's about white privilege on black-brown. That is, if there wasn't any kind of gender piece to it, it's white privilege on black-brown. So you and I need to become best friends, and we'll encourage each other, because we really have a tremendous amount in common, and thank you for saying what you did. By the way, I've talked to one girl who was being bought, a teenager, and she said the time that her phone was the most active was on Monday mornings after the man had spent the weekend with his wife and kids. And so, yeah, what's that about? Right? Okay, yes, please.
Hi, sorry. Matthias with the World Bank's ID for the Initiative. I want to thank you for bringing up...
Could you say that again?
Sorry, my name is Matthias Witt. I'm with the World Bank's Identification for Development Initiative.
Oh, great, thank you.
But my question, actually, I want to thank you for bringing up this issue of racial justice as well. And sort of the hypocrisy, if you want to call it that you pointed out, for us doing international work, looking at child trafficking overseas and holding up these other countries to all these standards, was simultaneously more or less turning a blind eye to what's happening here. Many of what you just said in terms of statistics was new for me as well. I didn't know these numbers and how disproportionate they really were. So my question to you is also, aside from the work that I could be doing professionally, but just personally as an individual and as a white male, what can I do just in everyday life to contribute to changing the narrative and to speaking up and to just doing something about this issue?
Well, I really appreciate how the urgency in your voice. Please.
One white man to me.
Yeah, one white.
Yeah.
One white male to another.
That's right.
There's so many layers to that. I think a few things. I think one, trying to use sometimes the privilege that you're afforded as a white male, and instead of using that privilege and hoarding it for yourself, trying to share that privilege and divert it to those that aren't being offered that privilege. So I was invited the other week to give a major keynote address in front of this big corporation. And instead of taking it, I said, why don't you invite a survivor to give the keynote address instead, and I'll give the warm-up address for 10 minutes, but she needs to be the keynote speaker. So I think in one way, being aware of the spotlight that you're sometimes given and calling people out when they're giving you that spotlight too much or disproportionately, and trying to share that. And whether or not I've done that enough in the field or not, that's something that I think about. I think there are some practical things, like join the No Such Thing campaign, like quit using the word child prostitute, right? In your colleagues in the World Bank, if you see anybody using the that word, right, beginning to call that out and make that word something that no one really says anymore. In policy, in written policy, and in spoken word. I think there are so many things that involve learning from survivors, really. I think when I joined Polaris in 2004, the three main staff at Polaris were Derek, Kat, and Tina from Courtney's house. And a lot of our time was spent listening to Tina and having Tina teach us about her experiences in the sex trade and share with us her expertise about what the police could be doing differently. Like, I've got 30 ideas about how you could catch more buyers. Just talk to me, right?
Yeah,
and
right,
instead of
right.
us trying to bring that up. So I think the survivor engagement and survivor inclusion piece, not just for a survivor telling their story, but actually asking, can you share your expertise with us about, if we're going to try to create this paradigm change, how would you do it? And they'll have dozens of ideas. So those are just a handful of ideas. But I think it's a lens. It starts with the lens, and then that lens manifests in lots of different ways if you let it.
Can I just add to that? I've always seen this issue, especially in the U.S., as being the razor's edge, right, of rape culture. So I think part of being able to be a voice against child trafficking is also being a voice against rape culture. And then I think the other piece that I would add to that is because you are in an international context, the urgency of being able to say in that space that gender-based violence is borderless, right? And certainly the US is culpable in our own acts of gender-based violence and trafficking. And the importance of being able to have that conversation in a truly global manner that does not cut off the US from its responsibility and its place. And, sorry to be partisan, but it's actually not being partisan, in light of the kind of language that has happened around the election and presidency, it's an especially important time as Americans that we really be able to take stock of the way in which we normalize violence against women and girls.
Thank you. Who's the timekeeper? Is there a timekeeper? 10 minutes. 10 more minutes? Yes. Hallelujah. Okay. Yes. What is it? Yeah, anyone have a thought right now?
She just gave me the mic. This is Jack Warner. I'm a former D.C. government senior official, also a Kennedy School alum. My question is, you're talking about how to standardize, and we're doing a lot of discussion here on the law enforcement side of things. I'd like to get more on the policy side of it and how we can start working with state legislatures, how we can start working with the governor's offices, how we can start working with the mayor's office, county commissioner's offices. What it looks like is really needed, and we were talking here at the table about it, is that there's got to be a point of access in government, both state and local, that people can go to, these organizations here that can go to, that the individuals can go to and say, here's the issue, what can we do to solve it? And, can we put in place some policy? Can we put some legislation in place? What can we do to, to help the law enforcement side of things to be able to carry out their task? Let's put it in place, initially, and to get to your point in terms of how can this all be standardized and so forth. I mean, we've got a lot of associations out there, National Governors Association, National Conference of State Legislators, U.S. Conference of Mayors, National League of Cities. All these groups need to be putting in place committees and, getting individuals, governor's office folks and state legislator folks involved in creating a platform and a place for all this information to flow into so that standardized issues and policies can be coming out of that place. So, and the Kennedy School is a good place to start with some of this stuff. So I just want to put that on the table, and it really helps bring the law enforcement piece of it in, because then it gives it an anchor in terms of how it operates within the government.
Thank you. It's Jack, right? Yeah. Would someone out here respond to Jack, please? Yes. We need a mic? Yes. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Marcia Rabito with the Center for Human Trafficking Court Solutions, and I've thought about the problem that you've just posed, and I think one of the deficits that I see in this area is that we haven't really established the economic proposition for the fact that if we did pass legislation and if we supported various programs differently at the get-go, we would save the social system a lot of money. And there isn't research that's being done on that right now, and I think and again, I'm relatively new in this area, but it strikes me that one of the problems is the difficulty in identifying the victims, and then there's so few resources that the resources aren't being committed to the research that is needed to establish that economic proposition. And yet I think it's really critical in policy making. So, if anybody has information on that, if there is research being done along those lines, I think it's really important to get it out there, because it is time for legislators to act. But they're not going to act unless you can demonstrate to them that by doing something at the front end, you're going to save a whole lot of money. And of course, the victims' lives are so much more enhanced and given an opportunity.
Does anyone in the crowd, are you able to respond to that? The question of the, yes, please.
Hi, I'm Nathaniel Erb, and I run a private lobbying practice working with a number of different organizations.
I'm sorry, what's your first name?
Sorry, Nathaniel Erb.
Nathaniel.
ERB like the plant, but no H, couldn't afford it. Yeah. Now y'all know who I am. Yeah, I mean, in that regard, with the economics, it's definitely a thing that we've lacked in this field to focus on. I think in terms of just time of advocates to do, the research and engage universities and organizations who can do it. But we've actually started doing some of that, so I just put in legislation, amendments to the Maryland's human trafficking safe harbor protection legislation. And so with that, the new working group that'll be established is doing that research. And then I've done it in regard to working alongside University of Maryland and a couple other universities going after college education and all those pieces. So we have done it kind of piecemeal, but it's definitely something we can expand and do at a larger level.
Thank you. Yes, Brad or Malika?
Yeah, I mean, I would say a couple of things. One is that when we talk about law enforcement, I think part of the work and the policy approaches is not only doing the training, but being really clear in our policy practices and recommendations of who in law enforcement should be responsible for this area. It should not be vice, right? It should be, where I have seen it the most effective is where it's law enforcement that deals with crimes against children. Right? Because if it's taken from that context, then law enforcement has a language around the victimization of children, understands resources that can be used, that they use in other spaces around children being sexually abused, right? So children's advocacy centers, when we see that law enforcement that deals with crimes against children, there is the relationship with the CAC, and that's where we want, right, law enforcement engaging with the kids who are being bought and sold, so that they have the background, the expertise, and the relationships with the providers who understand the complexity and severity and trauma of child sexual abuse. I think the other piece here is also, I think there are beautiful examples that are happening in different parts of the country around ending the arrest of children for prostitution, and recognizing that we can shift this from an act of criminalization to an act of support and services. So the work, for instance, that's been happening in Chicago, where when the child is identified, the child is not put into a criminal holding. And then the other piece that I would put next to that is I still don't understand from a policy perspective how any state or local entity drawing down TVPA funds is still allowed to arrest a child, right? Because the statute reads that there cannot be the arrest of a child for prostitution, right? I mean, that's essentially what the statute says, that an individual under the age of 18 can only be construed as engaging in commercial sexual exploitation, and therefore you cannot arrest that child for prostitution. So I still feel like we have to get at this policy issue that we have states and localities drawing down on those TVPA funds and yet continuing to arrest children. And I think that's a place of policy that we all need to go after.
Brad, this is going to be the last word. Make it compelling.
It's all on you.
Wow. I think what Jack, to your question, I think that what was really amazing to me was how so many of the laws at the state level got passed between 2004 and 2014, and the amount of organizations that contributed to making that happen. And a lot of those organizations are here in the room today. But really what happened was one state came up with a model, and then groups hustled to make sure that model touched all 49 other states. Like when the very first states in the country were passing state-level anti-trafficking laws after the TVPA passed in the year 2000, Washington State passed their own state-level version in 2002, Texas in 2003. There's like 2 states out of 50 that had this law. And then lots of different organizations said, let's just hustle this law across the country. And we would literally sit there with envelopes and we would write letters to all 48 other state legislatures and send the letter and say, this state just passed this great law, you should have one too. Please contact us if you're interested. And then we got, like 15 states got back in touch, right? So I think that's what's going to need to happen. There's going to be probably 4 or 5 key laws that emerge at the state level. And I think this AG's guidance will highlight what those laws are. One of them is the commercial sexual abuse of a child in Washington State.
That's the
Then really you need probably 3 or 4 people across the country who are paid a full-time salary at ECPAT or at Polaris or at Rights for Girls or at NCMEC or at Fair Girls or any of the places here who live and breathe contacting the other 49 states and basically championing and saying, let me teach you how to pass this law. Yep. Let me put you in touch with the authors of this law. Let's make it work for your state. Oh, there's some particularities. We didn't realize that. Let's tweak it for your state. And if we've got 3 or 4 full-time people hustling those 49 other states with organizations backing them up, I think in the next 5 to 7 years, we'll see a passage of laws at the state level backed up by NCSL and NGA and U.S. Conference of Mayors and League of Cities and all the groups that you said. You get those folks in as supplements, right? But you pass these laws until you get to the point that it's at the Uniform Law Commission and then all 50 states really start hearing about it. We'll get to the point where all 50 states have a commercial sexual abuse of a minor statute or a how to prosecute this as child rape and not as solicitation, with really 4 or 5 full-time people living and breathing for 3 or 4 years, which is a modest investment of like $400,000 or $500,000, right? It's actually shocking that for $400,000 or $500,000 you could change all 48 states' legislation, right? It's amazing, and that happened for safe harbor laws, that happened for vacating convictions laws, that happened for trafficking laws, and so many others. And now's the time for it to happen for laws related to demand and laws related for demand of children, and we'll see it sweep. And it's just a nuts and bolts point. I think Malika and Malika can way better than I can speak to the norms and speak to the history and the legacy, and then I'll try to back her up by saying, here's some nuts and bolts of just doing it, right? But I think,
traveling roadshow.
I think like one person employed somewhere doing this full time would have a huge impact on the country, and that's really how it's going to happen, supplemented by everything else we shared on the panel.
I think that's right.
Malika, bring it home. Join Brad in the benediction. You can do it. You've got 4 sentences.
Wow. I stand on the shoulders of everybody here, right? I mean, we have been in this work together, and this is the next iteration of the work, is making sure that we pass this legislation state by state so that no child is raped with impunity.
Thank you all so much, and thank you all for this conversation.